Welcome, everybody, to the MacMillan Center. We're delighted to be able to host Shashi Tharoor as the speaker for the 16th Annual Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture Series at Yale. This lecture was established in 1992 to support endeavors among specialists at the intersection between international relations, international law, and the management of international enterprises and organizations. The MacMillan Center sponsors the event along with the Law School and the School of Management. Shashi Tharoor was the official candidate of India for the succession to the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2006. He has a long and distinguished career leading up to that point. It began in 1978 when he joined the staff of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva, and it included key responsibilities in peacekeeping after the Cold War and as a senior advisor to the Secretary General, as well as the UN Undersecretary General for Communications and Public Information. Tharoor is an award-winning author of 9 books, and most are centered on Indian themes. Perhaps his most famous book is The Great Indian Novel, published in 1989. His novel Show Business, published in 1992, may be known to many in this room because it was made into the film Bollywood in 1994. He's also written literally hundreds of articles, op-eds, and book reviews in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the International Herald Tribune, Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Hindu, and the Times of India. The title that he's chosen for today's lecture, I will tell you in a minute. But before doing that, I just want to say that our session today will run until 5:30. The lecture will be about 45-50 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions and discussion. Following that, there will be a reception for everybody up on the second floor, and we hope that those of you who don't get to ask your questions during the session will come up to the reception and continue the conversation there. But that's enough from me. The title for today's lecture is India and China, Competition, Cooperation, or Conflict. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much, Ian. And I could tell from that introduction that, alas, you've been looking me up on the internet. So one of the great dangers these days when you come and speak to new audiences that you suddenly start seeing these telltale signs. And I'm very grateful for the kind words, but there have been occasions where, particularly at universities, I found myself being introduced by things I haven't actually done. But Ian was relatively modest. I know people who look you up on the internet and then look up deeds and misdeeds up the family tree. I mean, those of parents and uncles and aunts, and I'm sure one day my sons, who are both Yaleys, class of '06, will start featuring in my introductions as well. But in one particular instance, a friend of mine was introducing a speaker whom he looked up on the internet, and he found that this chap had an uncle who'd been electrocuted at Sing Sing prison for kidnapping and armed robbery or something equally horrible. But having taken the trouble to look this up, he felt he had to use it. So he said, our distinguished speaker had an uncle who occupied the chair of applied electricity at one of the nation's leading institutions. Which is just by way of saying that some of these kind words should be taken with a pinch of salt. But thank you. It's a privilege to be here at my, as I said, my twin boys' alma mater. Though I'm sorry that this invitation came 2 years late. I mean, parents particularly enjoy opportunities to embarrass their children, and I feel slightly miffed that you've deprived me of that possibility. But nonetheless, for the rest of you, I'm glad to see you all here. So my topic today deals with the rise of India and China in the world, and I thought I'd turn that off, but I will do so now, and I urge you all to follow my example, of course. Two countries whose development will have a significant impact on the global system and on the world's sense of where international economic and political power will shift in the decades to come. Of course, India and China are really two countries out of four in that famous acronym coined by Goldman Sachs a few years ago, BRIC, for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, whose success and prosperity that New York firm broadly and boldly forecast in 2003. According to the experts at Goldman at that time, they said China is likely to overtake the US as the world's largest economy by the late 2020s, provided, of course, that it continues its policy approaches. India, on the other hand, would have to do much more in terms of economic reform and do it more vigorously. But if it did, it too could eclipse the US at Goldman Sachs by 2050. Now, we are, of course, talking in gross terms here. I think no one expects the average Indian's lifestyle to be better than the average American's in 2050, since there will be 4 times as many Indians on the planet as Americans. But still, it's rather striking. And well, in 4 decades, China's per capita income, even with more than 1 billion people, might be equal to America's. So we're talking of some pretty significant transformations that Goldman was predicting, because China's per capita income today is about $2,500 to America's $40,000, and India's is just about $800. So one would think that America is not a valid comparator, but according to Goldman, it is. Now, their analysis, of course, assumed that GDP growth rates of 8 to 10% would be sustained by both China and India for the 10 to 15 years after their prediction, and in India's case, of course, for longer. And of course, we all know from recent events that has turned out to be an unduly optimistic assumption. We also know that both China and India are revising their estimated growth rates downwards. But the underlying positives that Goldman talked about are not entirely wrong. Both countries have multiplied their per capita income levels many times over since 1950, and they've done so far faster in recent years than Britain or the US did during and after the Industrial Revolution. The idea that both China and India could triple their current economies in the next 20 or 25 years is not implausible to most economists, and even the World Bank in their last but one annual assessment of global economic prospects said as much. Now, I'm not an economist, and I've always been profoundly skeptical of those who issue forecasts of any sort. To me, the future is never quite what it used to be. But few will disagree that China and India are going to be richer than they are now, both in absolute terms and in relative ones. And that's why it is meaningful to speak of an increasing shift of economic and, as a result, political power in the world, and to ask how the two countries, which fought a short but brutal war just 46 years ago, will deal with each other in the process. Now, China and India are the two most populous countries in the world, with India set to overtake China's population around 2034. They account for nearly 1/10 of global GDP, 1/5 of world exports, and 1/6 of all international capital flows. China and India are the world's 4th, well, I shouldn't really say that because China has become 3rd now. I think it's gone ahead of Germany. So 3rd and 13th largest economies in dollar terms. They both rank higher, of course, in purchasing power parity, PPP terms. China holds by far the largest foreign currency reserves in the world at about $2 trillion. Half of that is held in US paper. And we all know that if it pulled its money out of the US Treasury, China could at one stroke destroy the US economy at some considerable cost to itself, of course, which is why this won't happen. But it reflects a significant level of US dependence on China. India is not quite in that league. We can say with some confidence that India and China will continue to prosper and will pull more millions out of poverty than they've ever done, that they will compete effectively with Western corporations for business, that if we look at the last few years' trends, they will continue to purchase foreign companies and assets, expand their trade and overseas investments, invent and develop new technologies, and displace more economic weight around the world. And as a result, they will inevitably demand more authority in the international system. China already has a fair bit. India will ask for more, and I do believe they will acquire it. China will be, in my view, the country that strips the US of its current designation of being the world's sole superpower. I don't mean that China will become the world's sole superpower. It'll simply knock that adjective out of commission. We'll be dealing with a two-superpower world once again. And this may happen within a generation. India will not stride the global stage to that extent, but it will be a significant player in its own region and through the attraction of its soft power, the strength of its culture, its values, its democracy. It will be hugely influential well beyond its borders. And I think neither is going to be a bit player on the global stage, and that's why they're worth talking about today. Both are currently expanding their hard power. China's military budget increased by a staggering 17.8% in 2007. I haven't seen the 2008 figures, but I gather they're close. It launched an unmanned space orbiter last year and announced a major expansion of its naval and submarine fleet. India is behind, but it's broadly heading in the same direction. Many of you know that India recently became one of a handful of countries, I think 4 countries, to land a lunar probe on the moon. India is also committed more and more to expanding its military budget, developing a serious blue water navy. India was involved in a naval engagement off the African coast a few months ago against a pirate ship. So we're talking about countries whose reach is going significantly beyond their immediate borders, or at least their potential reaches. Still, of course, both countries together would have a long way to go before they can compete with the US, whose defense budget is currently equal to that of the rest of the world combined. So it would be foolish to suggest that military power is also shifting to the east in absolute terms. But I still think that what's happening is again significant in terms of its effect on the overall balance globally. I'm not one of those who shares in the formulation of the British historian Neil Ferguson, who in the last chapter of his recent book, The War of the World, wrote of the descent of the West. I don't think the rise of the East needs to imply the fall of the West. And certainly, I think what we're talking about is at best a rebalancing, not some sort of shift of power from the Western world to China and India. But even this, of course, would only be a partial reversion to the historical state of affairs. According to the economic historian Angus Maddison, back in 1820, China and India together accounted for nearly half of the world's total economic output. India, 5th of global GDP, China nearly 27% in 1820. Neither is close to those numbers today. Even the most optimistic projections for their rise do not see these two countries in the imaginable future accounting for 50% of global GDP anytime in the 21st century. So even if we're talking about some genuine, remarkably interesting numbers in terms of the shift of economic capacity, it would not bring these two countries back to the position they occupied individually or together just 2 centuries ago. But to look at the recent rise of these two countries is, however, remarkably instructive. Those who visited China during Mao's time would not recognize it today. It's a country that has remade itself physically to a point that its visible physical infrastructure is almost entirely new. The extraordinary cities with their dense forest of skyscrapers, their 6-lane expressways studded with overpasses, their gleaming modern airports, their large and throbbing ports. At one point, I heard I'm sure the by now tired joke that the national bird of China ought to be the crane, since there's so many of them around the country. The transformation has been so dramatic that a little fishing village in 1990 called Shenzhen is now one of the world's largest and most prosperous modern cities. The rows of massed bicycles across Beijing have given way to choking fleets of spanking new cars. The dull grey Mao tunics of old have been replaced by colourful clothes of the latest styles and cut, made or at least copied in China itself. The supermarkets overflowed with consumer goods of every conceivable description, again mainly made in China and exported to the rest of the world, including to those countries that designed those products in the first place. Institutions are acquiring new habits and traditions undreamt of in the Maoist past. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at Beijing University, and for my pains, I was presented with a handsome red and white official university tie. So when I returned to UN headquarters in New York, I made it a point to wear my new tie at a meeting with a senior Chinese official who I knew had graduated from Peking University. He made no comment about the tie, so I was provoked to ask him, "Don't you recognize what I'm wearing?" "No," he replied, and then it struck me. When he had attended Peking University, there had been no such thing as an official university tie, for the simple reason that in those days no one in China even wore a tie. So China has little use for ancient or even recent tradition. It simply invents a new tradition when it has need of one. Instead of being hemmed in behind tightly controlled borders, Chinese are now free to travel and study abroad. I'm sure quite a few here at Yale. Almost 1 million have done so in the last 3 decades, including some 130,000 who are currently studying in foreign countries, acquiring skills that many, a majority, maybe most, will bring back to their native land. The private sector, unknown in Mao's day, bids fair to rival the state-owned enterprises that were the initial engines of China's growth and prosperity. It's not all good news. China is also more polluted than ever before, with air unfit to breathe, visibility in Beijing shockingly limited by smog, and rivers poisoned by toxic effluents. It's also a much more unequal society, an irony for a country that still calls itself a People's Republic and is ruled by an ostensibly communist party. What about India? I could say a great deal more about my own country, but perhaps I'll permit myself just one illustrative example, since my most recent book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, is about the recent transformation of India. Well, 2/3 of the title is perhaps self-explanatory. It's India is the land of the animal fable, as perhaps many of you know. It's, Aesop plagiarized his fables from the Indian Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. So I begin with a Panchatantra type fable about India, thinly disguised, though the adverb isn't accurate, as an elephant, a sort of lumbering, slumbering, ponderous beast, marred in its own dust and mud, covered in flies, slow to move, slow to change, that somehow in recent years appears to be acquiring the stripes of a sinewy, lithe and agile tiger. Well, where does a cell phone come in, you might ask? Well, to me, the cell phone is the instrument that most epitomizes this change. See, I grew up in an India in which telephones were pretty rare. In fact, when I left India in 1975 to go to the US for graduate studies, we had perhaps 600 million residents in the country, and there were just 2 million landline telephones. Now, having a telephone was a rare privilege. If you weren't a wealthy businessman or an important government official or a doctor or a journalist, you might just languish in a long waiting list for phones and never get one. In fact, so rare were telephones that members of parliament, elected members of parliament, had amongst their privileges the right to allocate 15 telephone connections to anybody, to the 15 people they deemed worthy. But if you did have a phone, it wasn't necessarily a blessing. I spent my high school years in Calcutta, and I remember the phone sitting in the front hall, and each day we'd pick it up and hopefully pray for a dial tone, which usually was not, in fact, available. If you got a dial tone and you dialed a number, the words you heard more often than hello were wrong number. Or you might actually be connected to a call, except it wasn't the call you dial. It's an ongoing conversation amongst two people who are blissfully unaware that you've just joined their conversation. There was even a technical term for this. It was called a cross connection. These are connections that made us very cross. And then if you wanted to call another city, let's say from Calcutta, where Professor Chanda there and I spent some time, you would say to call Delhi, you had to book something called a trunk call, and then you sat by the phone all day waiting for the call to come through. Or you could pay 8 times the going rate, it was a very high going rate, for something called a lightning call. But in those days, even lightning struck rather slowly in India, because a lightning call took a minimum of half an hour to come through, whereas a trunk call took several hours. Frankly, as late as 1984, when a member of parliament rose to protest this woeful, appalling service by what was a public sector monopoly, a government service, our then communications minister replied in a lordly manner that communications in a developing country are a luxury, not a right, that the government had no obligation to provide better service, and if the honourable member was not satisfied with his telephone, could he please return it, since there was an 8-year-long waiting list of people waiting for this inadequate instrument. Now fast forward to today. When I finished writing my book, which was in May of 2007, I was able to report in it that in April 2007, India had just set a new world record by selling 7 million cell phones that month, which was actually more telephone connections than had been established by any country, the US and China included, in any one month in the history of telecommunications. Well, the book, went off to the publishers and got printed and bound and arrived in all good bookstores, even New Haven, and that figure was already out of date. because by the time it hit the bookstores in December of 2007, India had broken its world record 3 times and had sold 8.3 million cell phones that month. The book, I'm pleased to say, is still in print, but the figure is even more woefully out of date. Last July, India sold 9.22 million cell phones. In October, it breached the 10 million barrier. January of this year, 11 million cell phones. And last month, though the figures are still unofficial, it may have actually sold 15 million. So India has now overtaken the US as the world's second largest telephone market. Did that already in January. It's smaller than China, but growing a lot faster. And what you're seeing is not just a story of numbers, not even just a story of attitudes. From that of the communications minister I quoted to the Enlightened Telecoms Regulatory Authority of today. But it's also a very interesting question of who's carrying these cell phones. Most of you non-Indians here, when you go to India, which I hope you'll all do, will be driven everywhere. Not just if you happen to be in a position where you get a chauffeur-driven car, but even if you just go and rent a car, because India is one of those countries where the car rental companies know it's actually cheaper, by the way, for you to rent a car with a driver than without one. Because the car rental companies know that if you haven't grown up driving in India, their risks go up if they rent you a car without a driver. So you'll have a driver. Okay? 99% chance your driver's carrying a cell phone. And it won't be one that the company's given him. He can afford it because we have the cheapest cell phone rates in the world. The average Indian cell phone bill is $4 a month. If you visit Delhi, go to the suburbs of Delhi, on the side streets of the suburbs of Delhi, you'll find a fellow with a wooden cart that looks like it was invented in the 18th century. On it rests a coal-fired steam iron that looks like it was invented in the 19th century. He's got an istriwala. His job is to take an ironing from the neighborhood. And he'll be carrying that 21st century instrument, a cell phone. Because in most Indian plans, incoming calls are all free. So it costs him nothing to get a call from an apartment saying, come and pick up a sari or a shirt to iron. A few months ago, I visited the country farm of a friend of mine in the southern state of Kerala. This is a rural area about 20 kilometers away from any place you'd consider urban, dotted with coconut trees. And it was a hot day, so he said, hey, would you like some fresh coconut water? Which, of course, is the best thing to drink, most refreshing, most nutritious thing in a tropical country on a hot day. So I said, sure. So he whipped out his cell phone, dialed a number, and a voice said, I'm up here, and right on top of the nearest coconut tree, with his waistcloth tied around his knees, a hatchet in one hand and a cell phone in the other, was the local toddy tapper, who promptly brought down a couple of coconuts for us to drink. Fishermen in Kerala are now going out to sea with their cell phones, and after they catch their fish, they're calling every market town along the coast to find out what it costs, which market will offer them the best price for the fish they've caught. So fish prices are going up, but the fishermen are earning better livelihoods. Farmers. In the old days, at harvest time, a farmer would either have to trudge off the market town or send an able-bodied relative, who might be an 8-year-old boy, on a 10, 12-kilometer walk to the nearest market town, go and see if the market was open, go and see whether the particular product they just harvested could be sold, what price they would fetch. Then the poor kid would walk back the 10 or 10 kilometers, give the news to the farmer. They would then load the carts, head off to the market town. Half a day's back-breaking labor, now saved with 1 2-minute phone call. In other words, the cell phone as the symbol of India's transformation, simply because it has empowered the Indian underclass in ways in which 45 years of talk about socialism, like China's 45 years of talk about communism, had singularly failed to do. But of course, there's still a long way to go. It's become a cliche to speak of India as a land of paradoxes. The old joke about our country is that anything you say about India, the opposite is also true. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. Our information technology experts stride confidently into the 21st century, but much of our population seems to live in each of the other 20 centuries. Quite often the opposites coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India, that actually went around the internet, so some of you may have seen it, is a photograph from the last Kumbh Mela, the big Hindu religious festival, of a naked sadhu, straight out of central casting. Okay, matted hair, scraggly beard, gap-teeth grin, beads around his neck, naked torso. And in this photograph, this naked holy man was chatting away on a cell phone. And this I even suggested it to the publishers of my new book as a perfect cover image. But they assured me it was so well known it had become a cliche in itself. And so they put another cliche on the cover, but that's what publishers do. But cliches are cliches because they're true. And the paradoxes of India say something painfully real about our society. A place where bullock carts are still an indispensable mode of transportation for millions, but whose rocket and satellite programs are amongst the most advanced on Earth. So having given you this very sketchy, brief portrait of the rise of China and India, I'd like to reflect on two aspects of their rise. First, the question of commonalities, competition, complementarities between the two of them, and second, the risk of conflict. There are many other aspects, obviously, of the rise of China and India on which I wish I could dilate, and I dare say there are people in this room who know more about much of this than I do. But in the limited time available, that's what I'll focus on. I look forward to a lively exchange in the discussion that will follow. So first, commonalities, complementarities, competition. It's become rather fashionable these days in bien-pensant circles in the West to speak of India and China in the same breath. These were till recently the two big countries said to be taking over the world, the new contenders for global eminence after centuries of Western domination, the Oriental answer to generations of Occidental economic success. Last year, two new books came out explicitly, or was it 2007 perhaps? Well, late 2007, early 2008, explicitly twinning the two countries. There was Forbes magazine correspondent Robin Meredith's The Elephant and the Dragon, The Rise of India and China and What It Means for All of Us. And there was Harvard business professor Tarun Khanna's Billions of Entrepreneurs, How China and India Are Reshaping Their Futures and Yours. Both books, though different in scope and tone, see the rise of India and China as literally shifting the world's economic and political tectonic plates. Some even speak of Chindia, as if the two are joined at the hip in the international imagination. Now, personally, count me amongst the skeptics. It's not just that, aside from the fact that both countries occupy a rather vast landmass called Asia, they have very little in common. It's also that the two countries are already at very different stages of development. China started its liberalization in 1978, a good decade and a half before India. It shot up faster, it hit double-digit growth when India was still hovering around 5%, and with compound growth, it's put itself in a totally different league from India, continuing to grow faster from a larger base. But it's also that the two countries' systems are totally dissimilar. If China wants to build a new 6-lane expressway, as they decided they wanted to from 1990 onwards, China can bulldoze its way past any number of villages in its path, and it's done so. In India, if you want to widen a 2-lane road, you could be tied up in court for 12 years over compensation entitlements. When China built the Three Gorges Dam, it created a 660-kilometer-long reservoir that necessitated the displacement of a staggering 2 million people, and it managed to accomplish all that in 15 years without a fuss in the interests of generating electricity. When India began the Narmada Dam project, aiming to bring irrigation, drinking water, and power to hundreds of millions of people, it has since spent 34 years so far fighting environmental groups, human rights activists, and advocates for the displaced, all the way to the Supreme Court, while still being thwarted in the streets by protesters from non-governmental organizations like the Save Narmada movement. Now, this is how it should be. India is a fractious democracy. China is not. But as an Indian, I do not wish to pretend that we can compete in the global growth stakes with China. In fact, in case anyone wanted confirmation that Chindia, twinning India with China, is, to put it mildly, premature, one has only to look at the medals tally at the last Beijing Olympics. China proudly ranked first with 51 gold medals out of a total of 100 medals altogether. You have to strain your eyes past such stepchildren of the global family as Jamaica, Belarus, war-torn Georgia, collapsing Zimbabwe, and even what used to be called Outer Mongolia, before stumbling across India in 50th place with precisely 3 medals, 1 gold and 2 bronze. Now, this is not, in fact, a surprise. Whereas China has set about systematically striving for Olympic success since it re-entered global competition after years of isolation, India has remained complacent about its lack of sporting prowess. Where China lobbied for and won the right to host the Olympics within 2 decades of its return to the Games, India rested on its laurels after hosting the Asian Games in Delhi in 1982, so that it is now considered further behind in the competition for Olympic hosthood than it was 2 decades ago. Where China embarked on Project 119, which is a program devised specifically to boost the country's Olympic medal standings. The number 119 refers to the number of golds awarded at the Sydney Games of 2000 in such medal-laden sports as track and field, swimming, rowing, sailing, and canoeing. We Indians wondered if we would be able to crack the magic ceiling of 2, the highest number of medals our country had ever won at this quadrennial exercise in international sporting machismo. Where China, seeing the number of medals awarded in kayaking, decided to create a team to master a sport hitherto unknown in the Middle Kingdom, India did not even lobby successfully for the inclusion in the Olympic Games of the few sports we do play well. Kabaddi, for instance, a form of tag team wrestling, or polo, or even cricket, which was played in the Olympics of 1900 and has been omitted since. Where China has maintained its dominance in table tennis and badminton and developed new strengths in non-traditional sports like rowing and shooting, India has seen its once legendary invincibility in field hockey fade with the introduction of AstroTurf, to the point where our team even failed to qualify for Beijing this year. So forget India, our two countries barely belong in the same sporting sentence. But what's happened at the Olympics speaks to a basic difference in the two countries' systems. It's the creative chaos of all singing, all dancing Bollywood versus the perfectly choreographed precision of the Beijing Games opening ceremony. The Chinese, as befits an autocracy, approached the task of dominating the Olympics with top-down military discipline. The objective was determined, a program, Project 119, was drawn up, the considerable resources of the state were attached to it, state-of-the-art technology acquired, world-class foreign coaches imported. India, by contrast, approached these Olympics as it had every other, with its usual combination of amiable amateurism, bureaucratic ineptitude, half-hearted experiment, and shambolic organization. In China, national priorities are established by the government and then funded by the state. In China, priorities emerge, in India, priorities emerge from seemingly endless discussions and arguments amongst myriad interests, and funds have to be found where they might. China's budget for preparing its sportspersons for these games alone exceeded all of India's expenditure on all Olympic training for the previous 60 years. Many of India's national endeavors remind me of the old saw that I heard 3 decades ago when I first strolled the corridors of the Ministry of External Affairs in India. I was told then by a grizzled old veteran of Indian diplomacy that Indian diplomacy is like the lovemaking of an elephant. He said it's conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, this is no longer true, I'm happy to say, of Indian diplomacy. But it is, alas, true of many Indian economic reforms and other schemes like Olympic participation. It's all promulgated from on high with much fanfare and then taken age to be implemented because of all the interests to be accommodated, all the vested interests and obstacles that have to be overcome. But where China's state-owned enterprises remain the most powerful motors of the country's development, India's private sector, ducking around governmental obstacles and bypassing the stifling patronage of the state, has actually transformed the fortunes of the Indian people. That's the cell phone story for you. So it proved again in the Olympics. The wrestlers, boxers, runners, tennis players, and weightlifters who made up the bulk of the Indian contingent, accompanied by the inevitable retinue of officials, returned with just 2 bronzes amongst them, while India's only gold in shooting was won by a young entrepreneur with a rifle range in his own backyard and no help from the state whatsoever. Young Abhinav Bindra is at 25 the CEO of a high-tech firm, a self-motivated sharpshooter who financed his own equipment and training, and an avid blogger. He is, in short, a 21st century Indian. At one level, it's not surprising that he should have won India's first individual gold in any Olympics. In fact, ever since a transplanted Englishman competed in Indian colors in the 1900 Games. India is the land of individual excellence despite the limitations of the system. In China, individual success is the product of the system. But if we can't compete, can we cooperate? The two civilizations had centuries of contact in ancient times. Thanks mainly to the export of Buddhism from India to China, Chinese travelers came to Indian universities going back 1600 years, visited Indian courts, wrote memorable accounts of their voyages. Nalanda University, which flourished in northern India for 7 centuries from 427 AD and attracted students from across Asia, received hundreds of Chinese students in its time, and a few Indians went the other way. A Buddhist monk from India built the famous the Chinese here will forgive my pronunciation, Lingyin Si temple in Guangzhou in the 5th century. In southwest India, Kerala's coastline is dotted with Chinese fishing nets, and the favorite cooking pot of the Malayali housewife is the wok, which is locally called the Chin Chetti, which means Chinese vessel. It's been a while, though, since Indians and Chinese had much to do with each other. The heady days of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, Indians and Chinese are brothers, the slogan coined by Nehruvian India to welcome Zhou Enlai in 1955, gave way to the humiliation of the 1962 border war, after which it was Hindi Chini Bye Bye for decades. The bitter border dispute between the two countries remains unresolved, with periodic reports of incursions by Chinese troops onto Indian soil and new irritants over anti-Chinese protests of Tibetan exiles who've been given asylum in India. And I'll come back to this later when we talk about potential conflict. To speak of a trust deficit between the two countries is arguably an understatement. And yet there has been some good news. Trade doubled for 3 years in a row. It's to an estimated $40 billion this year, 2008. China has now overtaken the US last year as India's largest single trading partner. The two countries have publicly said they will raise their bilateral trade flow to $60 billion by 2010, and they're aiming for $100 billion by 2014. Both New Delhi and Beijing are emphasizing that they want to be, quote, cooperative partners, not competitors, to quote the words of Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. During his visit to India in November 2006, China's President Hu Jintao agreed on a 10-point plan with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to increase cooperation, with a focus specifically on commercial and economic exchanges. Hu spoke of what he described as the enormous potential for increased bilateral business ties. When Prime Minister Manmohan Singh visited China in January of 2008, he and Premier Wen agreed to increase the volume of bilateral trade and also to resolve their border issues through peaceful negotiation. That's not all. Tourism, particularly of Indian pilgrims to the major Hindu holy sites in Tibet, Mount Kailash and Lake Mansarovar, is thriving. Indian information technology firms have opened offices in Shanghai and Hangzhou. Infosys, the big Indian computer firm in Bangalore, recruited 9 Chinese last year for their headquarters. There are dozens of Chinese engineers working in and learning from Indian computer firms and engineering companies, while Indian software engineers in Chennai and Bangalore are supporting the Chinese telecoms equipment manufacturer Huawei. By and large, India is good at things that China needs to improve at, notably software. China excels at hardware and manufacturing, which India sorely lacks. So India's Mahindra & Mahindra manufactures tractors in Nanchang for export to the United States. The key operating components of Apple's iPod were invented in India by the Hyderabad company Portal Player, but the iPods themselves are manufactured in China. Philips employs nearly 3,000 Indians at its innovation campus in Bangalore, who write more than 20% of Philips' global software, which in turn goes to Philips' 50,000-strong workforce in China to turn into brand-name goods. In other words, the elephant is already dancing with the dragon. The only question is whether the two countries can prolong the dance or whether political tensions could bring the music screeching to a halt. There is no doubt that whatever the differences between the two countries, cooperation is in the best interests of both India and China. The two countries have economic complementarities that could make such cooperation mutually beneficial, as the examples I've given you of companies in both countries are already proving. But, of course, the issue gets fairly complicated, particularly if one sees the question of comparative advantages and assumes that China is way ahead of India in every respect. The story is a little more nuanced. In absolute numbers, the Chinese are way ahead. China's export of electronic goods now tops 180 billion a year. 1 out of every 3 shoes, or maybe I should say pairs of shoes, exported in the world is made in China. They make 75% of the world's toys. And foreign direct investment, of course, is at the level of $70 billion a year. For comparison, India was proud to end last year at a record level of 25 billion. Shanghai alone has nearly 4,000 skyscrapers, which is not only more than all of India, but exceeds those of Los Angeles and Chicago combined. China has built an estimated 60,000 kilometers of expressways in less than 2 decades and will soon outstrip the entire length of the US highway network. Per capita income has risen nearly tenfold since 1978, and the number of people living in absolute poverty in China has dropped from a figure of 425 million 2 decades ago to an official figure of 26 million today. The population is almost totally literate, life expectancy is reaching developed country levels, and as I briefly mentioned earlier, China has overtaken Germany to become the world's 3rd largest economy, behind the US and Japan, but it won't stay number 3 for long. But against this are a number of factors that suggest that not everything is rosy. Economic growth has occurred at breakneck speed, but that means some necks have been broken. The human cost of development in China has not been negligible. Population displacement, farmers thrown off their lands, villages flooded by dams, mounting pollution, low-wage labor in appalling conditions, widening disparities between the rich and the poor, an absence of human rights, and few checks on governmental abuses. The Chinese have seen great and rapid improvements in their internet access, but Beijing still employs some 40,000 cyber police to monitor politically undesirable activity on the web. Equally important, China's success has not just been China's. A disproportionate share of the benefits goes abroad to the foreign companies that have set up factories in China. It's been estimated that of the $700 American price of a Chinese-made laptop, only $15 actually remains in China. Only 4 of the country's top 25 exporters are Chinese companies, according to Robin Meredith, who adds that in practice, quote, made in China really means made by America or Europe in China, unquote. The Chinese financial system also has a way to go. Whereas India has been running sophisticated stock markets since the early 19th century, and my compatriots are so skilled at doing so that they got the Bombay Stock Exchange up and running within 24 hours of a terrorist bomb blast that nearly destroyed the building in 1992, China is new at the game and not particularly adept at it. The financial information provided by China's companies, especially those in the large governmental sector, is notoriously unreliable, and standards of corporate governance are low. There are no world-class Chinese companies with sophisticated managers to match Tata or Wipro or Infosys. China's capital markets are weak and its banks inefficient. The Chinese banking system carried an estimated $911 billion in unrecoverable loans as of 2007, mainly to government firms. In his recent book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, Professor Yasheng Huang of MIT argues that the Indian private sector is more efficient and entrepreneurial than the Chinese private sector. State-owned enterprises still account for half of China's economic assets. China has yet to master the art of channeling domestic savings into productive investments, which is why it has relied so extensively on foreign direct investment. India, on the other hand, does without it. It's actually exported FDI to OECD countries. Indian capitalists have bought assets in the developed world. In other words, India's entrepreneurial capital and management skills are better able than China's to control and manage assets in the sophisticated financial markets of the developed West. And the world is yet to develop any confidence in China's legal system, where a contract still means whatever the government says it means. In other words, it still lags behind India on the software of development, not just technical brainpower or engineering know-how, but the systems it needs to operate a 21st century economy in an open and globalizing world. The Chinese state is undoubtedly stronger and more efficient than the Indian state. But the Indian private sector is not only miles ahead of the Chinese private sector, it's compensating for the inadequacies of the state, whereas in China the state sector can still stifle the private, and both sides know it. And then there's politics. Whatever we might say about India's sclerotic bureaucracy versus China's efficient one, India's tangles of red tape versus China's red carpet, its unfurled red carpet to foreign investors, India's contentious and fractious political parties versus China's smoothly functioning top-down communist hierarchy, there's still one thing you've got to grant. India has become an outstanding example of the management of diversity through pluralist democracy. Every Indian has been allowed to feel that he or she has as much of a stake in the country and as much of a chance to run it as anyone else. After all, our last elections 5 years ago were won by an Italian woman of Roman Catholic faith, an Italian background, as I said, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. And our largest state today is ruled by a Dalit woman, a woman of the so-called untouchable outcast community. And somebody who, by the way, bids fair to have a crack at ruling the entire country if she can make the coalition arithmetic add up right after the next election. And she wasn't promoted by the Brahmin elite in New Delhi. She rode to the top on the ballots of her political base, building her own rainbow coalition along the way. Contrast this with Beijing, where political freedom is unknown, leaders at all levels are handpicked from the top for their posts, and political heresy is met with swift punishment, house arrest, or worse. During the Olympics, under international pressure, China designated a few areas where protesters could, in theory, peacefully gather. But you had to apply for permission to protest, which was never granted. And most of those who applied were arrested and detained, which meant that the authorization of protest became an excellent method for the security police to identify potential troublemakers without having to actually take the trouble of looking for them. India's politics means that its shock absorbers are built into the system. It has endured major road bumps, secessionist movements, terrorist violence, you name it, without the vehicle ever breaking down. In China's case, the limousine of state is driving smoothly along those expressways, but it's far from clear what would happen if that limousine of state actually ever encountered a serious pothole. The present system wasn't designed to cope with fundamental challenges to it, except through repression. But every autocratic state in history has come to a point where repression was no longer enough. If that point is reached in China, all bets are off. The dragon could stumble where the elephant can always trundle on. But as an Indian, I'm not trying to be complacent. India's problems are enormous, and there's still a great deal we need to do internally. Our teeming cities overflow, while 2 out of 3 Indians still scratch a living from the soil. We've been recognized for all practical purposes now as a nuclear power, but 600 million Indians still have no access to electricity, and there are daily power cuts, brownouts, even in the nation's capital. Ours is a culture which elevated nonviolence to an effective moral principle, but our freedom was born in blood, and our independence still soaks in it. We are the world's leading manufacturers of generic medication for illnesses such as AIDS, but we have 3 million of our own citizens suffering from HIV who don't have access to AIDS medication, another 2 million with TB, and tens of millions with no health center or clinic within a 10-kilometer walk of their places of residence. I talked about India holding the world record for the number of cell phones sold, but we also hold the world record for the number of farmer suicides. 17,000 Indian farmers killed themselves last year because when the harvest failed, they're under a crippling mountain of debt. The only way they see out for themselves is to take their own lives. Even though India has more dollar billionaires than any country in Asia, certainly more than China, even more than Japan, which has been richer for longer, we also have 260 million people living below the poverty line. And this is not the UN or World Bank poverty line, which has recently been revised to $1.25 a day. It's the Indian poverty line, calculated in rupees in rural India at 360 rupees a month, under 30 cents a day. So it's a poverty line drawn just this side of the funeral pyre, and there are people above that poverty line who would be considered poor by UN or World Bank standards. We've trained world-class scientists and engineers, many of whom have started companies in Silicon Valley. But 400 million of our compatriots are illiterate, and we have more children who have never seen the inside of a school than any other country in the world has. India has a great demographic advantage in 540 million young people under 25 today, which means we should have a dynamic, youthful, and productive workforce for the next 40 years when the rest of the world, including China, is aging. But we also have 60 million child laborers, and 72% of the children in our government schools drop out by the 8th grade. We celebrate India's IT triumphs, but information technology has employed a grand total of 5 million people, while 10 million are entering the workforce each year, and we don't have jobs for them. Many of our urban youth rightly say with confidence that their future will be better than their parents' past. But whereas Maoism is confined to ideologues' textbooks in China, in fact, a Hong Kong businessman friend of mine, a Chinese friend, said to me, the only place you'll truly meet a Maoist is in India. There are Maoist insurgencies violently disturbing the peace in 165 of India's 602 districts, and these are largely made up of unemployed young men. In other words, India has a great deal still to do to ensure that it keeps its people healthy, well-fed, and secure. Secure not just from Islamist terrorism, which has been in the headlines, and it's a real threat, but also from the daily terror of poverty, hunger, and ill health. The progress is being made. India has had success in carrying out three kinds of revolutions and feeding its people. A green revolution you've all heard about in food grains, a white revolution in milk production, and at least to some degree a blue revolution in the development of fisheries. But the benefits of these revolutions have not yet reached the quarter of our population living below that poverty line. And we have to do that before we can meaningfully speak of competing with China. I'll be a little briefer on the subject of the risk of conflict between the two countries so we can have 20-odd minutes for our exchange. As Indians painfully remember, we went to war in 1962. It was a decisive triumph for China, which wrested 23,200 square kilometers of Indian territory. At the same time, Beijing has taken pains in recent years to remind India that it still claims a further 92,000 square kilometers, mainly in the northeastern Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. It doesn't help that the two countries share the longest disputed frontier in the world, since the line of actual control of the LAC has never been formally delineated in a manner accepted by both sides. India's borders were defined by British imperial administrators in the 1913 MacMillan line, which China rejects vis-à-vis India, though it accepts that line as its frontier with Burma, Myanmar, which it was in those days part of British India. With the LAC coming into being in the wake of '62, the situation is even more unclear. Whenever troops from either side build roads, construct or repair their bunkers and other routine fortifications, or conduct patrols close to the LAC, tensions can and do repeatedly flare up. When the two sides are anxious to avoid provoking each other, such activities are kept to a minimum. But it would seem that Beijing has taken a conscious decision in the last couple of years to keep India on its toes. Why do I say that? Well, the first 6 months of last year, before the Olympic lull, witnessed a proliferation of incidents along the 4,057-kilometer frontier between the two countries. It's continued after the Olympics. An unofficial figure I saw in December put the number at 213 incursions with a month to go last year, up from 170 the previous year. These included no further than 65 incursions by the People's Liberation Army in just one sector alone, the evocatively named Finger area in Sikkim, which shares a 200-kilometer border with Tibet. Reports of intrusions into Indian territory have continued. They seem to be getting more brazen. In one reported incident, Chinese soldiers entered 15 kilometers into Indian territory in Ladakh and actually burned the Indian patrolling base. While Indian spokesmen appear anxious to downplay such reports, in an earlier incident inside the LAC, a mixed civilian-military team investigating reports of a previous Chinese incursion on the frontier were threatened and forced to retreat by a PLA formation and 3 armored vehicles. The Chinese soldiers allegedly assumed firing positions in the incident, leading the Indians to withdraw in order not to provoke a shooting match. And there are many, many more such examples that I'm going to skip, more patrolling and so on. China establishing 4 new air bases in Tibet, 3 in other southern provinces bordering India, the Indian Air Force then augmenting its own presence near the Chinese border. One could well ask what on earth is going on. Well, fears of imminent major hostilities, war in other words, are clearly overblown. China, flush from the huge public relations success of the Olympics, is hardly likely to initiate a clash, and India has no desire whatsoever to provoke its northern neighbor. Offsetting the stories of border incursions are good news stories, like the joint military exercises in December. Can you imagine the Chinese army and the Indian army, which had gone to war 46 years earlier, had joint military exercises last December, at which the Chinese soldiers euphoniously sang the Indian national anthem in an impeccable accent. And they reportedly didn't stop at Jana Gana Mana, the national anthem. A few Chinese soldiers showed their mastery of Bollywood music by breaking out into a Hindi hit film song to the appreciation of the Indian soldiers. Now, this is all to the good, but there's still a fundamental problem. It's clear that China's troubles over Tibet, at the beginning of last year, have brought with them unwelcome reminders to Beijing of India's hospitality to the Dalai Lama and his government in exile. Ironically, during the mass protests in Tibet in early 2008, The one country that was conspicuous both by its centrality to the drama and by its reticence over it was India. On the question of Tibet, both as the land of asylum for the Dalai Lama and, of course, of the angry young hotheads of the Tibetan Youth Congress, India finds itself on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, we are a democracy, one that has a long tradition of allowing peaceful protests, including against foreign countries when their leaders come visiting us. We provided refuge to the Dalai Lama when he fled the Chinese occupation of his homeland in 1959. We've granted asylum and eventually Indian citizenship to over 110,000 Tibetan refugees. And though we've permitted them to set up a government in exile, we have not recognized, and New Delhi does not recognize the government in exile as a government, but it allows them to live and function in the picturesque Himalayan hill town of Dharamsala. On the other hand, we've been assiduously cultivating better relations with China. Though the bitter border dispute, as I've described it, remains unresolved, and China has been a vital ally and military supplier to India's enemies across the border in Pakistan, the two countries have been warming to each other in recent years. So Delhi's always tried to draw a distinction between its humanitarian obligations as a country of asylum and its political responsibilities as a friend of China. So the Dalai Lama and its followers are told, we respect you as a religious leader and what you're trying to do religiously, but you can't conduct political activities. When the young Tibetan radicals wanted to march to Lhasa, the Indian police stopped them well before they got to the border and detained the protesters. When some Tibetan demonstrators outside the Chinese embassy in New Delhi attacked the premises, the Indian government stepped up its level of protection for the Chinese diplomats. And the Indian foreign minister used the occasion of a press conference alongside the American Secretary of State, Condi Rice, last year, to publicly warn the Dalai Lama against doing anything that could have a negative impact on Sino-Indian relations. So Indian officials have shown their acute consciousness of how sensitive the Chinese are on the question of the Dalai Lama. Having said that, and despite some political controversy in the country about it, India has really tried to make an effort not to alienate its largest trading partner, and it's sort of dancing delicately on the Tibetan tightrope. And yet the dangers are real, because the fact is that Tawang, the birthplace of the 6th Dalai Lama a couple of hundred years ago, and a major monastery of Tibetan Buddhism, lies in Arunachal Pradesh. And this deprives Beijing of a vital asset in its attempts to assert total control over Tibet. And there's no doubt that Beijing is hoping that once the Dalai Lama passes on, that they will find a suitable young boy in Tibet, whisk him off to Beijing, educate and indoctrinate him for some time, and then have a Dalai Lama who toes the Beijing line. I mean, that clearly is their intention. But the Dalai Lama, the present one, has announced that the next Dalai Lama may not be born in Chinese-controlled Tibetan lands. The suggestion is that he could easily emerge from the Tibetan diaspora or from traditional areas of Tibetan residents that are now in India, notably the Tawang Tract. The very fact that one Dalai Lama has emerged from Tawang makes that a potential area that could produce another one could be acceptable to the Tibetan people. Reminding New Delhi of China's claims to this territory is therefore all the more urgent for Beijing. China would like to take control of Tawang before it's too late. And that's why these tensions have been accelerating, in my view, and examples of surprisingly undiplomatic treatment of a visiting Indian foreign minister last summer and so on. And I think behind the unpleasantness lies a broader strategic calculation. With the end of the Cold War, Beijing had two options in relation to India: to see the country as a natural ally together with Russia in building up an alternative pole to US dominance in the region. This, by the way, has many starry-eyed Indian intellectuals behind such an approach. Or to identify India as a potential adversary to its own aspirations. The emergence of a stronger US-Indian partnership in recent years appears to have convinced China to place New Delhi in the latter category, even seeing it as a possible instrument of containment of China. Now, such a perception may have been reinforced by India's frequent military exercises with the US, Japan, and Australia, India's cultivation of the former Soviet stans in Central Asia, including the establishment of an Indian military base in Tajikistan, and India's attempts in recent years to establish strategic ties with countries that Beijing perhaps sees as falling within its own sphere of influence, from Mongolia to Vietnam, and including direct competition over Myanmar. Indeed, India's refusal to condemn the Burmese junta's crackdown on monks in mid-2007 was directly linked to India's competition with China for influence, strategic assets, and oil and gas from that unhappy country. Because our earlier policy of support for Burma's democratic forces had simply allowed China and its ally Pakistan to steal a march on India. India's Look East policy, developing closer relations with the countries of Southeast Asia, is not necessarily China-directed, but it would be disingenuous to deny that one of the reasons many Southeast Asian countries welcome India's involvement in their neighborhood is to offset China's overweening predominance in the region. A quick checklist of other factors that have added to the strains in the relationship. One is the Indo-US nuclear deal. China has been concerned about the American willingness to create an Indian exception, which they fear is an attempt to build up India as a strategic counterweight to China. And China made its hesitations apparent in the nuclear suppliers group, thus incurring, if not our wrath, certainly public statements of disapproval and disappointment from senior officials in New Delhi. Second is China's support for Pakistan, including military assistance and help for Pakistan's nuclear program, as well as support via North Korea for Pakistan's missile program, which confirms Indian suspicions that China wishes to use our troublesome neighbor to keep our regional ambitions, let alone global, in check. China's development of the port of Gwadar in Pakistan and of a Burmese port on the Bay of Bengal, reflecting its development of a naval capacity on India's flanks, has our strategists increasingly worried. On Beijing's side, India's inclusion in the East Asian Summit, which was pushed by Japan, Singapore, and Indonesia, primarily to limit China's influence, makes them see us as a rival in their own sphere of influence. Fourth, the two countries' competition for scarce energy resources and investment opportunities in markets such as Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, which pitted India and China as competitors with each other, usually to China's advantage. And finally, China's reluctance to support Indian, and for that matter, Japanese, aspirations to a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, because it has no desire to dilute its own status as a P5 member by sharing it with another Asian power. So the usually complacent elephant is wary of the hissing dragon, and the Sino-Indian frontier is unlikely to remain quiet. Needling and anxious to please New Delhi on its troubled northern borders helps China keep India guessing about its intentions, exposes the giant democracy's vulnerabilities with elections looming, and cuts a potential strategic rival to size. I do fear there might be more incidents on the border, and while we are focused on the threats to our safety from Islamist terror, it's clear that India cannot afford to relax our vigilance on our northern borders. Now, those are incomplete reflections. That leaves us just under 20 minutes for our exchanges, but I don't want to leave you on a pessimistic note. Though I've laid out a lot of good and bad news, no serious decision maker in either Beijing or New Delhi wants the bad news to prevail. India has too much self-respect to ever see itself as a counterweight to China. Its bilateral relationship with Beijing has its own logic, independent of any third countries. The economic cooperation I've described and the potential for increasing trade between the two countries could still prove more significant than either old or new tensions on the borders, as long as we don't see ourselves as rivals in a zero-sum game, and I don't think we do yet. In his recent book, Rivals, Bill Emmett quoted an unnamed senior Indian official as saying, "Both of us think that the future belongs to us. We can't both be right." Actually, I believe they can both be right. It's just that it'll be two very different futures, and there can be room for both in the world of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and particularly for taking us on a tour of so many horizons in one lecture. Would you like to field your own questions? And
Yep.
Yeah.
With the new Obama administration in the U.S. Wanting to pursue these protectionist policies as regarding to jobs, industry, do you see China and India actually coming together?
First of all, I'm not entirely sure how protectionist the Obama administration is going to be. There's some political rhetoric about protectionism, which is understandable, but they're yet to be translated into concrete policies. For example, when they speak of ending tax breaks for companies that outsource jobs, What exactly does that mean? Which taxes? And what tax incentives will they give to keep jobs in America rather than send them out? And will those incentives outstrip the obvious financial advantages to the bottom line of a company from outsourcing jobs elsewhere? These things are, frankly, yet to be clarified, and I think it's premature for us to assume that they will be very protectionist. I just don't see America doing without the enormous number of goods, number and range of goods it imports from China right now. So you're not going to overnight change things, because if you do, consumers in an economic crunch are suddenly going to find themselves paying, say, 4 times the price for an American-made pair of running shoes than they would for one made in China or whatever. And this is something that politically would not make a lot of sense. So I'm not alarmist yet about protectionism in this country. Whether that will therefore have an impact on China and India already improving their trade with or without a change of American policy. There was initially a lot of hesitation from Indian companies about the risks of dumping by the Chinese manufacturers, and India did bring a couple of anti-dumping actions against China. And it's true that there are some businesses in which Chinese manufacturers have essentially ended production in India. Certain kinds of toys, certainly, but even more sophisticated stuff. I was talking to somebody about certain colors of dyes, chemical dyes, certain kinds of paints. Oddly enough, China has such economies of scale on these things, have simply rendered the entire Indian manufacturing of these products unviable. And that kind of thing may create a certain amount of anxiety in the Indian space, unless China is equally open to importing what India can offer, which remains to be seen. I also think that both countries can do much more to open up the human traffic between them, particularly tourism. Right now we've got the very controlled Indian pilgrimage to Kailash and Mansarovar, but we don't really have extensive amounts of free issuance of visas on both sides. And I think one day the Chinese, who are now beginning to discover the world and are free to travel and have the resources, could discover India in a big way. I mean, you've got people interested, for example, in previous sites of Chinese travel and pilgrimage, but also people interested just in seeing different parts of the world, and we could open up there and so on. So those are all reasons why the two countries could do more together, but I'm not necessarily sure that either would see the other as a substitute for what they might lose out from a protectionist America. Yes, ma'am. I know a lot less about the Chinese-Russian border, but there haven't been incidents there for a heck of a long time. There were 1 or 2 famous incidents, including one during the Cold War, when they seemed to be mobilizing on both sides. But they've not been very many. Whereas in the Indian-Chinese border, you're talking 170 incidents in 2007, more than 213 in 2008. That's pretty serious stuff by comparison with 1 or 2 or 3 on the Chinese, on the Sino-Russian border. So I don't know. And I think part of the problem is that the nature of the dispute is more fundamental, because China essentially argues that the line itself is illegitimate, that it was drawn by imperialists, which is a little more complicated in the case of Tsarist imperialism than in the case of British imperialism. So I think that the Indian border issue goes fundamentally to that question, and of course to China's great, profound, almost irrational attachment to its sovereignty over Tibet, which is the border in question. The border we're talking about is almost entirely between Tibet and India. So that's the big concern they've got. Yes, ma'am, behind.
Thank you for your talk. As you mentioned, this rapid modernization of both countries, which will change the face of the planet, you didn't touch too much on the environmental impacts and the fact that 65,000 demonstrations a year are already taking place in China around this issue, or the water issues of glaciers in Somalia.
Melting.
Countries share river systems and so on, and the Nahali you didn't mention. But anyway, I'd love you to, of course, it's a huge topic.
It is a huge topic. I mean, the environmental issues are serious in both countries, and that's why both countries have changed their position on the global warming debate considerably in the last 15 years. If you look at the original Indian-Chinese position, it was essentially one of denial, right? It was the reason the planet's in a mess and we got global warming is because you guys in the industrialized world spent 200 years making yourselves rich and polluting the planet. Now we've discovered ways of making ourselves rich, and you've discovered the environment. tough, we're not going to do that. Now, they move from that quite a bit because obviously Indians and Chinese are themselves, choking on effluents and on bad air and suffering the consequences. And so they have now begun to say, yes, we understand there is a problem, but you have to bear a larger share of the cost because you're a larger contributor to the problems. Give us clean air technologies, give us help. And of course, there is the whole per capita argument that India makes even more strongly than China, which is that in absolute numbers, India and China are right up there in the top 10 polluters in the world. But on a per capita basis, the US is number one. India is somewhere like 120th of 190 countries in the world. So again, one has to look at allowances. In countries where there is a genuine problem of serious poverty, you can't say we will accept environmental constraints that will deny us the possibility of pulling people beyond the poverty line. We've got to be able to have industries that employ them and so on. So make it easier and more feasible for us to develop industries that use clean air technologies and other technologies that help us to be able to avoid damaging the environment and contributing to greenhouse gases and so on, and do more yourselves. I mean, this is the other thing. Just today I was reading on the internet about how the amount of greenhouse gases contributed by Britain's failure to adequately heat, to insulate their own homes during winter, and the amount of heating they consume vastly outstrips, large portions of what India and China are doing. And there are lots of things that the developed world could also do to set an example to the rest. That's on the sort of classical sort of environmental debate thing. Between the two countries directly, there is a serious issue. You mentioned the glaciers, but there's also the river systems. And there's some real worry about China's plans to dam the Brahmaputra, which India has already begun raising diplomatically. So far, it hasn't become a big international incident. But there is no downriver treaty. I mean, ironically, India and Pakistan have the Indus Waters Treaty. The headwaters of all the rivers that flow in Pakistan are in India. And even during times of war, India has not interrupted their flow in any shape or form. Here, at the time of a good relationship, relatively speaking, and a peaceful relationship, China is essentially threatening to transform India's economic fortunes for the worse by taking waters away. The Brahmaputra, which they call the Sangpo, I think, and which flows down through the Tibetan Plateau and in across Nepal into India, that is a vital source of nourishment and sustenance for India. So it's a potentially very serious issue that we hope the two countries will have the common sense to effectively negotiate and resolve. But it could be a potential flashpoint for a future version of this speech.
Yes.
So.
As you know, the U.S. has two wobbly allies in the region, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And India has a relationship, between relationship to Afghanistan, China, and Pakistan. How do you see that playing out in a very tender area, very explosive, potentially very explosive?
Oh, I think it's the most seriously dangerous place in the world right now, is that particular combination of circumstances. Afghanistan, as you said, is wobbling. Pakistan, sadly, is also wobbling. And that what we've seen with the troubles on the Afghan-Pakistan border have spilled over both into large areas of Pakistan and, of course, into Afghanistan itself. The real tragedy here is that this problem is man-made, as it were. I mean, it was created, first of all, in the creation, training, equipping of the Mujahideen to overthrow the Soviets in Afghanistan. So a lot of this, I'm afraid, some of these chickens are coming home to roost. Some of these chickens are born out of American eggs laid in the 1980s against the Soviets. But then the triumph in '88 and the withdrawal of the Soviets inspired the Pakistani ISI to turn their attentions to elsewhere, saying, look, if this can work against the Soviets, we can make it work against the Indians. And they decided to systematically use terrorism as an instrument of their foreign policy and their strategic defense policy. And the result has been that they, like good old Dr. Frankenstein in the novel, they created a monster which has now escaped their control. And the monster that has escaped their control is now threatening Pakistan's own sputtering democracy, as well as risking engulfing the entire region in its wake. What can we do? Certainly, India is working with a colossal amount of self-restraint in response to the Mumbai attacks, working diplomatically with America to try and put pressure on Pakistan to react responsibly, and not as Pakistan initially did, in a state of denial about what happened in Mumbai and Pakistan's own complicity in what has been generated. And America will have to continue doing its darndest to ensure that those forces within the Pakistani establishment that have at the very least condoned, if not orchestrated, some of the recent actions are brought to heel. There is no question that the Taliban/Al-Qaeda elements on the border with Afghanistan, the very ones who have attacked NATO forces and so on, have had assistance from the Pakistani military and Pakistani intelligence. In fact, the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul, the suicide bombing last July, was traced by American intelligence. I'm not quoting anything classified. The American intelligence agency spoke to the New York Times, so you can Google it, saying that this was done by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI. And the American intelligence source went on to say what surprised him was how little trouble the Pakistanis had taken to cover their own fingerprints. It was as if, he said, or he or she, we don't know who the source was, said, the Pakistanis were trying to send a signal to the Indians. Look what we can do to you in Afghanistan. And of course, a few months later, what was done in India. So it's a very, very serious situation. And sadly, it's fueled by the extraordinary generosity of American military aid, ostensibly granted $11 billion since 9/11, ostensibly granted to fight terror, some of which at least, if not much of it, having gone into nourishing those who have been fomenting, encouraging, guiding, commanding terror. It's truly an alarming, frightening thing. China's role so far has been somewhat mixed. There's no question that China saw Pakistan as an extremely useful agent in the region to curb both Indian and, in relation to Afghanistan, American strategic interests. Keep them on tenterhooks, that sort of thing. And as recently as 2 years ago, when America tried to ban Jamaat-ud-Dawa, the group that is the Lashkar-e-Toiba reborn, China blocked that ban in the Security Council. After the Mumbai attacks in November, however, China changed its mind and actually supported the attempt by the US and Britain to get Jamaat-ud-Dawa proscribed. Why? Partially because I believe China, which has been coming of age on the international stage, and I've been watching this at close quarters in the Security Council during my UN days, I think China now genuinely believes that it's no longer compatible with its increasing self-image as a responsible player in the international system to continue giving a shield to people who are conducting terrorist actions. Nonetheless, China's strategic interests are with Pakistan and not with either India or the US in that area. And so the danger is, if Pakistan wants to continue walking on the tightrope, will China, instead of adding to the diplomatic pressure on them, help them ease that pressure? We don't know, but it's not impossible that they might do. It certainly bears watching. They do. They've got the Uyghurs, they've got significant issues because some of these fellows appear to have been inspired by, and in some cases even trained by, elements in Pakistan. But at the same time, they seem to be reasonably satisfied that in that case, this has not been officially inspired. I mean, it's very clear that no official instance of the Pakistani state has any interest in destabilizing Western China, whereas elements attached to the Pakistani state, notably the military, have a very conscious interest in destabilizing India and Afghanistan. Gosh, you should really be playing traffic cop while I get some more.
Well, we only have time for two more, so yes, sir.
Dr. Tharoor, there's been increasing talk of your entry into Indian politics. So is there a final word on the Congress candidate from Palakkad or Thiruvananthapuram as the case may be?
Very well informed. Final word is about 10 days away. So this is a brief foray into reflections on other subjects, but I've been in India for a few weeks earlier this year, and I'm heading back there in mid-March, and almost certainly the answer is yes. I've been writing for quite some time about how in India it's a shame that in our democracy the educated middle classes have abdicated the political space to other people. We seem to be divided amongst kids who are good at taking exams and go into the IAS or the IFS or become lawyers or doctors or engineers, and leave politics to the kids who aren't good at taking the exams, right? So the result is we, in many cases, not all, in many cases, are led by people who are not worthy of the society they're trying to lead. And I think it's time that others saw if they could make a difference in the system. We might all fail, first of all being defeated by the electorate, and if not, perhaps being defeated by the system. But it's worth trying, and I think if the opportunity is confirmed, and as I said, it should be within a week or 10 days, I will take the plunge.
One final question at the back. Yeah. Talk a little louder.
This is my first time to hear this word. And I got to know that really before I was not aware of the conflict between India and China. But now I got to know something about it. Because in my middle school, we all know that India is a great country and it enjoys the same Buddhism with the Chinese people. And most of the family in China just believe in this kind of thing. But anyway, there is a combination of Confucianism of the Buddhism. But my question is that in the recent years, India has enjoyed the great, I think maybe the great growth of the population, and then it's even as much as many as the same population of China now very soon. So and also now the agriculture, there has some similarity. So do you have any plan to cooperation or something that we can exchange from each other about the way how to support the growing population?
Thank you both for your question and for the initial comment. I'm very glad you made that comment because it is rather instructive that unlike Pakistan vis-a-vis India, where unfortunately the textbooks in Pakistan are written to promote hatred of India with historical myths about a 5,000-year war between Hindus and Muslims and all sorts of nonsense. In China, there's a kind of historical amnesia about a conflict that's only 4 decades old, which is quite good. And in fact, I welcome that. I've been to China many times and spoken on campuses, and I'm always gratified. Because the first time I went, I wondered whether I would be seen as some sort of enemy. And I wasn't. On the contrary, I found a tremendously warm and welcoming reaction from Chinese students. And what little they seem to know about India, and they know very, very little indeed, appears to be fairly benign. And I congratulate China on that. I think as long as there isn't that negativism, there is much more scope for better people-to-people relations. And you're right to mention Buddhism. As I said, tourism, perhaps starting with the pivot of Buddhist centers in India, could be a good way to restore that. Certainly, I would recommend to you a chapter in Amartya Sen's book, The Argumentative India, about relations between India and China in the ancient days. It's absolutely fascinating. And he's done some remarkable research, and some of it is secondary research, all very well footnoted, about these contacts. And there's one marvelous story about a Chinese in the 4th or 5th century, I think, who came to university in India, studied, did so well that he was offered a professorship, stayed on and taught, then finally decided he had to go back home, went back to China and taught in a university in China. And then some Indian faculty members came to China and visited him. And correspondence has survived of that visit. And it reads like something that could have been written 1,500 years later today. You know, this guy asking, so how is so-and-so? Did he get tenure yet? I'm not joking. I mean, it's the most extraordinary thing. And this sort of extraordinary warmth and sort of shared experience, intellectual experience, cultural experience, was a characteristic of India and China for a very long time, which explains the romanticism of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, who had this whole notion during the nationalist period of India and China as the two great Asian civilizations that have been humbled by foreign invasion. And right throughout the 20s and 30s, he wrote about China, initially the China of the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek, later the China of Mao, with a great deal of admiration. In fact, he insisted on inviting China to his Asian Relations Conference. Then when the PRC was formed, India was very quick to recognize it, even though many countries did not do so. India sponsored China's entry into the world of international diplomacy. It ferried Chinese diplomats to talks on Air India planes. In fact, one Air India plane was blown up by suspected Taiwanese saboteurs because it was carrying the Chinese delegation to the Laos talks, I think it was. Bandung talks. Nehru personally introduced Zhou Enlai to the other leaders of what became the Afro-Asian Summit, and thereafter the non-aligned movement. But I think China actually resented this. You know, they seem to see India as, the Chinese leadership, as developing pretensions above its station. Who are the Indians to patronize us in this way? This is fair. Nayan is a great expert on all of this, and he's sitting right there. And I think that may have partly lain behind what happened in '62, because when the '62 war occurred, Li Shaoqi said, we're going to teach India a lesson. And then 16 years later, when China attacked Vietnam, Deng Xiaoping actually said, we're teaching Vietnam a lesson the way we taught the Indians in '62. So that kind of thing doesn't obviously go down well in Delhi, and it doesn't go down very well. But I still feel that you may be right, that the hostility is confined to a small section of people who focus on foreign policy issues. Frankly, if you read the academic journals that are published in China, I can only read them in translation, on the Indo-Chinese, the Sino-Indian border, it's blood-curdling stuff. I mean, there have been articles in the last 3 months that have called for actual military action, to take back, quote unquote, the territories of Arunachal Pradesh. So there is this small segment of Chinese academia, how influential they are on the policy, we don't know. Some of them are writing for PLA-approved journals. Does that mean we should worry about them trying to use force? I'm just saying all of this does exist. But you made the very important point that I wanted to underscore, that amongst ordinary Indians and Chinese, there is no such hostility. On the population question, frankly, there is not much common ground. China tried a very draconian one-child policy. To some degree, it worked in keeping your population growth down. Another degree, it hasn't worked because you've created huge social problems on the one hand, and secondly, you've created a situation that is going to come to haunt you in future decades, when one child is going to be supporting 4 grandparents. So if you have 4 grandparents to look after a young man, because you seem to be of an age to have been one child in your family, that is going to be a serious challenge for young Chinese. India had a very brief experiment for 20 months with a more draconian approach during Mrs. Gandhi's state of emergency in 1977. In a democracy, you can't do that sort of stuff. It failed comprehensively, and Mrs. Gandhi and her government were turfed out of the next election. And after that, no one has tried any compulsory means. In many ways, India's understanding of the issue is broadly correct, which is that development is the best contraceptive. That people aren't poor because they have too many children. They have too many children because they're poor, because children become a source of social security, an investment in their future. Children, you don't know if the children are going to survive because your health care isn't good enough, so you have many children hoping some will survive to look after you in your old age. You're not going to send them off to be educated, so they're not a net loss to you. Instead, you send them out to the fields to work, or send them out to factories to weave carpets or sew footballs or whatever. But when development takes place and more opportunities come, more children survive, they're not dying anymore. And you have to send them to school. And when you send them to school, you've got to get them uniforms, there's meals, all sorts of things. Children become an expense and not immediately an asset. You start having fewer. And all of this has been demonstrated in the West, it's been demonstrated in Africa, it's been demonstrated in many parts of India. With development, family size will shrink. And that may be the way to deal with population. I just don't see India and China reading off the same sort of book, as it were, on the issue of population policies. The results will be different, and perhaps in some ways our experiences explain that difference, and our systems explain that difference. Thank you very much. I'd love to have carried on, but